Bougainville, Solomon Islands. November 8, 1943. 0427 hours. Sergeant Jacob Marsh crouched behind a shattered palm trunk, rain hammering his helmet, mud sucking at his boots, and watched a Japanese Type 95 Hago tank crawl toward his position to the pre-dawn darkness. 30 yards out, engine growling, treads churning. The turret swiveled, searching for targets. Marsh had a Thompson submachine gun. The tank had 2-inch steel armor. It wasn't a fair fight, except Marsh wasn't carrying standard .45 ACP rounds. He was carrying something else. Something that shouldn't have been possible. Something that would make the crew inside that tank wish they'd never heard the word Bougainville. He flipped the selector to full auto, aimed at the driver's vision slit, and squeezed the trigger. The Thompson roared, and the tank started burning. The modification began 4 months earlier in a supply depot outside Port Moresby, New Guinea, where a Marine armorer named Vincent Caldwell sat at a makeshift workbench surrounded by crates of aviation ammunition, disassembled Thompson magazines, and a problem that nobody else thought was solvable. Caldwell was 34 years old, a former machinist from Pittsburgh who'd enlisted in 1940, spent 2 years maintaining aircraft ordnance, and earned a reputation as the man who could make anything fit anything, even when the specifications said it was impossible. He was tall, lean, with hands that never stopped moving and a mind that treated every obstacle as a puzzle waiting to be solved. His commanding officer called him the Tinkerer. His squad mates called him crazy. But when the Marines needed something built, modified, or reimagined in the middle of a jungle with no supplies and no backup, they came to Caldwell because he didn't see limitations. He saw possibilities. The problem was brutal and getting worse with every island campaign. Japanese forces were dug into fortified positions, bunkers reinforced with steel plates, coconut logs, and coral rock. They used light tanks, armored cars, and improvised armored trucks to support infantry assaults and hold key positions. American infantry had rifles, grenades, and submachine guns, none of which could penetrate armor. Bazookas worked when they were available, when they didn't misfire, when the range was right. But bazooka teams were priority targets. They got hit first, hit hard, and once they were down, infantry had no answer to armor. Men were dying because they couldn't punch through steel. And Caldwell, sitting in that depot, staring at crates of .50 caliber aircraft ammunition marked API for armor-piercing incendiary, thought there had to be a way to give infantrymen the firepower they needed without waiting for heavy weapons that might never arrive. API rounds were designed for one purpose: to destroy enemy aircraft. The bullets had a hardened steel core for penetration, surrounded by an incendiary compound that ignited on impact, turning punctured fuel tanks into fireballs and shredding engines from the inside. They were devastating, effective, and completely incompatible with infantry weapons. The .50 caliber rounds were too large for anything except heavy machine guns mounted on vehicles or aircraft. You couldn't hand-load them, couldn't carry them on patrol. And even if you could, no rifle or submachine gun in the American arsenal was chambered for .50 caliber. It was a dead end, except Caldwell didn't see dead ends. He saw a challenge. And the challenge was this: if he could take the incendiary compound and armor-piercing core from the API rounds and fit them into a cartridge that worked in a standard infantry weapon, he could give Marines the ability to punch through armor with weapons they already carried. The problem was physics and chemistry and a dozen other technical barriers that should have made the whole idea impossible. He started with the Thompson submachine gun. It was reliable, widely issued, and chambered for .45 ACP, a round designed for stopping power at close range, but with zero penetration capability against anything harder than flesh. The cartridge itself was large enough, in theory, to hold a modified payload, but the tolerances were tight. The pressures were different, and if he got the formula wrong, the gun could explode in the shooter's hands, turning the weapon into a fragmentation grenade. Caldwell didn't care about the risk to himself. He cared about the risk to Marines who'd carry the ammunition, so he worked methodically, obsessively, testing every variable, documenting every result, and refusing to move forward until he was certain the design was safe. The first step was extracting the incendiary compound from the .50 caliber API rounds. The compound was a mixture of magnesium, barium nitrate, and a stabilizer that kept it inert until impact. Caldwell disassembled over 200 rounds, carefully scraping out the compound, weighing it, analyzing it, and storing it in sealed containers. Then he fabricated miniature armor-piercing cores using hardened steel salvage from damaged aircraft parts, machined down to fit inside a .45 ACP casing. The cores were tiny, barely 3 millimeters in diameter, but dense enough to punch through steel plate if the velocity was sufficient. He tested the cores by firing them from a standard Thompson at a salvaged piece of Japanese tank armor. They penetrated. Barely. The holes were small, clean, and didn't cause catastrophic damage. But it was proof of concept. The cores worked. Now he needed the incendiary compound to work with them. The challenge was timing. The incendiary had to ignite after penetration, not before. If it ignited too early, the round would lose penetration capability and just burn on the surface. If it didn't ignite at all, it was just a mediocre armor-piercing round with no secondary effect. Caldwell needed the compound to remain stable through firing, through flight, and through the initial impact with steel. Then, and only then, as the core punched through the armor and decelerated inside the target, the compound had to ignite, releasing heat and flame that would turn the interior of a vehicle or bunker into an inferno. It required a precise chemical balance, a specific placement within the cartridge, and a redesigned bullet jacket that would fragment on penetration, exposing the incendiary core to oxygen. He spent 3 weeks testing formulations, adjusting ratios, and firing test rounds into steel plates mounted over sawdust-filled boxes to simulate the interior of a vehicle. Most of the tests failed. The compound didn't ignite, or it ignited too soon, or the core didn't penetrate deep enough. But on the 19th test, everything aligned. The round punched through the steel, and 2 seconds later, the sawdust ignited. Flames poured out of the entry hole. The temperature inside the box spiked to over 800 degrees. Caldwell stood there, staring at the burning steel, and allowed himself a single grim smile. He'd done it. He fabricated 50 rounds. Modified .45 ACP cartridges, each one hand-assembled, each one containing a miniature armor-piercing core and precisely measured charge of incendiary compound. He marked them with a blue stripe around the base of the casing, kept them separate from standard ammunition, and then he did something that would have gotten him court-martialed if anyone in command had found out. He didn't report the modification, didn't file paperwork, didn't seek authorization. He just handed the rounds to a Marine sergeant named Jacob Marsh, a squad leader from the 3rd Marine Division, and told him to field test them. Marsh looked at the blue-striped rounds, looked at Caldwell, and said, "What do these do?" Caldwell said, "They burn through armor. Use them on hard targets. Don't waste them on infantry. And for God's sake, don't tell anyone where you got them." Marsh nodded, loaded the rounds into his Thompson magazines, and headed back to the front. Caldwell watched him go, heart pounding, stomach knotted, because he had no idea if the round would save lives or end them. The first engagement came on November 8, 1943, during the Battle of Bougainville. The 3rd Marine Division was pushing inland from the beachhead at Cape Torquena, advancing through dense jungle and swamp toward Japanese defensive positions anchored by concrete bunkers and light armor. Marsh's squad was tasked with clearing a trail junction held by a Type 95 Hago tank, and a reinforced infantry squad dug into spider holes. Standard doctrine said call for air support, call for artillery, or pull back and wait for armor. But the trail junction was critical. If the Japanese held it, the entire advance would stall, and there was no time to wait. Marsh made the call. His squad would take it, with small arms, and hope. The tank appeared at 0427 hours, just as the rain started. Marsh saw it through the trees, low silhouette, turret rotating, moving slow but deliberate toward the Marine positions. His men opened fire with rifles and a single bar. The round sparked off the armor, doing nothing. The tank's machine gun chattered back, ripping through foliage, forcing everyone down. Marsh knew they had seconds before the main gun zeroed in. He pulled the Thompson, checked the magazine, saw the blue-stripe rounds loaded, and made a decision that shouldn't have worked. He broke cover, sprinted 15 yards to the left, flanking the tank's line of fire, and aimed at the driver's vision slit. The opening was narrow, barely 4 inches wide, protected by thick glass and steel framing. A normal .45 round would have bounced off. Marsh didn't know if the blue-striped rounds would do any better, but he didn't have options. He flipped the selector to full auto and fired. The Thompson hammered. 10 rounds. 12. 15. The recoil jolted his shoulder, mud splashing around his boots as he held the trigger down. Half the rounds missed, sparking off a hull, but 3 hit the vision slit, and those 3 changed everything. The glass shattered, the steel framing cracked, and then, 2 seconds later, flames erupted from the slit. Not smoke, not sparks, flames, bright, chemical white flames that poured out of the opening like a blowtorch. The tank lurched to a stop. The engine rev, high-pitched, panicked. Then the hatches blew open and 2 crew members tumbled out, uniforms on fire, screaming, rolling in the mud. The third didn't make it out. Marsh heard him inside, a sound that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The tank burned, and the Japanese infantry, seeing their armor support turn into a crematorium by submachine gun fire, broke and ran. Marsh's squad stared. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. They just watched the tank burn, watched the flames lick out of every opening, watched the metal hull start to glow red in places where the heat was most intense. Finally, one of the Marines, a kid from Texas named Hollis, said, "Sarge, what the hell was that?" Marsh looked at his Thompson, looked at the magazine, looked at the burning tank, and said, "I have no idea." But he knew one thing. He needed more of those rounds. A lot more. Word spread fast. Not through official channels. Not through after-action reports. But the way news always spreads among infantry. Whispered conversations. Stories swapped in foxholes. A Marine corporal told his platoon sergeant. The platoon sergeant told a company commander. The company commander didn't believe it until he saw the wreckage of the tank himself, saw the entry holes in the vision slit, saw the way the interior had been incinerated. He didn't ask questions, didn't demand explanations. He just found Marsh and said, "Where'd you get that ammunition?" Marsh said, "From an armorer in Port Moresby, guy named Caldwell." The commander said, "Get me in contact with him. Now." Within a week, Caldwell was producing the modified rounds in bulk, quietly, unofficially, using salvaged materials, scavenged API compounds, and a small team of Marines who understood that what they were doing was outside regulations, but absolutely necessary. They set up a workshop in a maintenance tent, worked in shifts, and manufactured over 800 rounds in 3 weeks. Each round was hand-assembled, hand-inspected, and marked with a blue stripe. Caldwell established strict protocols. The rounds were only issued to squad leaders, only used against hard targets, never fired indiscriminately, and never, under any circumstances, allowed to fall into enemy hands. Marines were ordered to police their brass, recover spent casings, and if they were in danger of being overrun, destroy the remaining ammunition rather than let it be captured. The secrecy wasn't about protecting American tactical advantage. It was about preventing the Japanese from understanding what they were facing. Because fear of the unknown is more powerful than fear of the known, the effectiveness was immediate and devastating. Marines armed with Thompsons loaded with blue-striped rounds began engaging armored targets that previously would have required anti-tank weapons. Type 95 tanks, armored cars, reinforced bunkers with steel doors, improvised fighting positions covered by metal plates. The rounds punched through, ignited, and turned enclosed spaces into ovens. Casualties among Japanese armor crews skyrocketed. Vehicles were abandoned. Crews refused to enter tanks that might be hit by armor fire. The term Japanese soldiers started using to describe the phenomenon, because they didn't know it was submachine gun fire. The sound, the cyclic rate, the way the rounds came in rapid bursts, made them think it was a new type of automatic cannon. Intelligence reports from captured documents described unknown American anti-armor weapon, rapid fire, incendiary effect, effective against all light armor. Japanese commanders requested immediate analysis and countermeasures, but there were no countermeasures because the weapon wasn't new. It was just a Thompson with the right ammunition. The psychological impact, was as significant as a tactical one. Tank crews began exhibiting signs of acute stress, refusing to advance, demanding infantry support before moving. Some crews simply abandoned their vehicles rather than risk being burned alive inside them. Japanese infantry, seeing their armor support immobilized by fear, lost confidence in combined arms tactics. Attacks became more cautious, less coordinated, easier to repel. Marine casualty rates dropped. Enemy breakthrough attempts failed. And all of it traced back to a modification that shouldn't have been possible, developed by a man who refused to accept that infantry couldn't fight armor. But as with all unauthorized innovations, the official military bureaucracy eventually took notice. In January 1944, a Thompson submachine gun was recovered from a battlefield by a Marine supply officer conducting routine equipment inspection. The weapon had been damaged by shrapnel, deemed unsalvageable, and tagged for disposal. During disassembly, the supply officer found a magazine still loaded with 4 blue stripe rounds. He'd never seen ammunition marked that way. He pulled one, examined it, noticed the unusual weight distribution, and sent it to Division Ordnance for analysis. The ordnance officer disassembled the round, identified the armor-piercing core and incendiary compound, cross-referenced it against authorized ammunition types, and found no match. He filed a report. The report went to Division Headquarters. Division sent it to Fleet Marine Force Pacific, and within 72 hours, an investigation was launched. Caldwell was summoned to appear before a board of inquiry led by a colonel named Patterson, a career officer with a law degree and a reputation for zero tolerance toward unauthorized modifications. Patterson sat behind a field desk, the disassembled round laid out in front of him, and said, "Did you manufacture this?" Caldwell stood at attention and said, "Yes, sir." Patterson said, "Were you authorized to do so?" Caldwell said, "No, sir." Patterson leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, eyes locked on Caldwell's face, and said, "Do you understand that unauthorized modification of military ordnance is a court-martial offense?" Caldwell said, "Yes, sir." Patterson stared at him for a long moment. Then he said, "How many of these did you make?" Caldwell said, 837, sir." Patterson's eyebrows went up. "And how many failures? Misfires? Premature detonations?" Caldwell said, 0, sir." Patterson picked up the round, turned it over in his hand, studying it. Then he said, "Explain how it works." Caldwell did. Calmly, methodically, he walked through the design, the chemistry, the testing protocols, the safety measures. He explained why standard anti-tank weapons were insufficient, why infantry needed a portable solution, why the Thompson was the ideal platform. He showed photographs of test results, documented penetration depths, thermal readings, and field reports from Marines who'd used the rounds in combat. He explained the psychological impact, the way enemy armor had been neutralized not through destruction, but through fear. When he finished, Patterson sat in silence for a long time. Then he said, "You realize that if one of these rounds had failed catastrophically, you'd be responsible for the death of a Marine." Caldwell said, "Yes, sir. That's why I tested every round. That's why I established protocols. That's why I trained the men who used them." Patterson looked at him. Then he said, "Get out of my office and make me 2,000 more." The order was unofficial, verbal, no documentation, no paper trail. Patterson understood that Caldwell had violated regulations, ignored protocol, and operated outside the chain of command. But he also understood that the rounds worked, that they saved lives, and that in combat, results matter more than process. He couldn't officially authorize continued production, but he could look the other way. He could make sure Caldwell had access to materials. He could ensure that the modified ammunition continued to reach the Marines who needed it. And he could make damn sure that if anyone higher up the chain started asking questions, the inquiry would get buried under layers of bureaucracy until the war was over and nobody cared anymore. Caldwell went back to work, expanded his operation, trained additional armorers, established quality control standards. And by March 1944, over 3,000 blue-striped rounds had been distributed across Marine units fighting in the Pacific. The rounds were used at Peleliu, at Iwo Jima, at Okinawa, Every time a Marine squad encountered armor, bunkers, or fortified positions, the Thompsons came out, loaded with blue stripe rounds, and the targets burned. Japanese forces continued to file reports about the mysterious armor fire weapon, continued to speculate about new American technology, continued to fear it. And that fear, more than any bullet, more than any bomb, helped break the psychological resilience of an enemy that had been taught never to surrender, never to retreat, never to show weakness. Because when your armor burns, when your bunkers become crematoriums, when the weapon you're facing defies every tactical assumption you've been trained on, fear becomes inevitable. But back in the United States, in the research facilities of Springfield Armory and Aberdeen Proving Ground, military engineers were developing their own armor-piercing ammunition for infantry weapons. Official programs, proper funding, authorized testing. They designed a .45 caliber armor-piercing round using tungsten cores and hardened steel jackets. It was effective, it was safe, it was properly documented, and it was nothing like Caldwell's design, because the official round didn't have an incendiary component. It penetrated, but it didn't burn. It didn't create the secondary thermal effect that turned vehicles into death traps and bunkers into ovens. It was a good round, but it wasn't a round that Marines wanted, because the Marines had already seen what the blue stripe rounds could do, and they knew the difference. When the official armor-piercing .45 ACP was adopted in mid-1944, the blue stripe rounds quietly disappeared. No order was issued, no directive was sent, but supply lines shifted. API compounds were rerouted to authorized programs. Caldwell's workshop was reassigned to standard maintenance duties, and within 6 months, the blue stripe rounds were gone, replaced by official ordnance that met specifications, passed inspections, and didn't make tank crews abandon their vehicles in terror. The official rounds worked, but they didn't inspire legends, didn't create myths, didn't get a name like armor fire whispered in fear by enemy soldiers. They were just ammunition, functional, authorized, forgotten. Jacob Marsh survived the war, came home to Iowa, worked as a mechanic, married, had 3 kids, never talked about Bougainville, never mentioned the blue stripe rounds, never described the way the tank burned, the way the crew screamed, the way the Japanese infantry broke and ran. He kept his service medals in a drawer, attended veteran reunions once or twice, but he didn't share stories, didn't relive the past, because some memories are too heavy to carry into conversation, too brutal to explain to people who weren't there, who didn't see what those rounds could do, who didn't hear the sound that followed. He died in 1982, age 63, of a heart attack, sitting in his workshop, surrounded by tools and engines and the quiet satisfaction of a man who'd survived hell and built a normal life on the other side. His obituary mentioned his service, mentioned his family, didn't mention the Thompson, didn't mention the rounds that burned through armor, didn't mention the tank on Bougainville, or the fear in the eyes of enemy soldiers who called his weapon armor fire. Because history doesn't remember every innovation, doesn't honor every act of defiance against doctrine. Sometimes the stories just fade, buried with the men who lived them. Vincent Caldwell stayed in the Marines until 1946, retired as a master sergeant, moved to Oregon, opened a small machine shop, spent his remaining years building custom tools, repairing equipment, and quietly training apprentices in the art of precision work. He never sought recognition for the blue stripe rounds, never filed for patents or wrote articles or gave interviews. He just did the work, kept his head down, and moved forward. He died in 1979, age 69, of cancer, alone in a hospital room in Portland, with no family present, no ceremony, no memorial service. His obituary ran in the local newspaper for sentences, mentioned his military service, mentioned his shop, didn't mention Bougainville, didn't mention the rounds that punched through steel and burned, didn't mention the hundreds of Marines who survived because he refused to accept that submachine guns couldn't fight tanks, because the world doesn't always remember the innovators, doesn't always honor the men who solve impossible problems with nothing but skill, determination, and a willingness to break every rule that stands between their troops and survival. But the legacy remained. The concept of using incendiary compounds in small arms ammunition became a cornerstone of modern ordnance development. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds for rifles, machine guns, and eventually personal defense weapons. All of them trace their lineage back to men like Caldwell, who saw a gap between what infantry needed and what infantry had, and filled that gap with ingenuity, chemistry, and machine steel. The official histories don't mention him. The textbooks don't credit him. The museums don't display his work. But the soldiers who carried those blue-striped rounds into battle knew. They knew that for a brief, brutal period in the Pacific War, they had a weapon that struck fear into an enemy that feared nothing. A weapon that turned light armor into coffins and bunkers into crematoriums. A weapon that the Japanese called armor fire, spoken in whispers, in reports, in the quiet conversations of men who'd seen their tanks burn from submachine gun rounds and couldn't explain how it was possible. And sometimes, late at night, in the moments before sleep, the old Marines who fought on those islands would remember. Remember the sound of the Thompson roaring. Remember the way the steel glowed. Remember the way enemy soldiers screamed and ran when their armor started burning. They didn't talk about it much, didn't share the details, but they remembered, and that memory, passed quietly from one generation to the next, is the only monument Vincent Caldwell ever received. A whispered story, a half-forgotten legend. A single question asked in hushed tones at veteran gatherings and military history forums. Did you ever hear about the rounds that burned through armor? The ones the Japanese called armor fire. And the answer, always quiet, always respectful, always edged with the weight of lived experience. Yeah, I heard, and I was there when the tanks burned. Subscribe for more untold stories from men who defied the impossible. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below.